So I'm going to reference Gnostic Statistical Manual. Lighting's really poor right here. I don't have the 5th edition. I've read reviews about the 5th edition. I've seen some of the context clipped out of it, and I really don't feel the need to ever own the 5th edition. I think it's honestly just a Neptune and Pisces conspiracy to medicate and drug everybody. That's just my opinion on that. Antisocial personality disorder 301.7 diagnostic features. It's been criticized that it's definitely underdiagnosed, but not only in the general population, but with women. And usually, most of the time, the only way that you can get somebody who can meet all the requirements to be diagnosed with this is if they're incarcerated, because most people who have no desire to tell any psychotherapist the things they're experiencing, people with this kind of disorder use it to their own personal advantages. I just highlighted a couple things in advance. I'm just gonna go over those. So if it seems kind of fragmented, I'm just going over the important parts of this. APD disorder, a pervasive pattern of disregard for, violation of rights of others that begins in childhood or early adolescence and continues into adulthood, referred to as psychopathy, sociopathy, and dissocial personality disorder. Deceit and manipulation are central features of this disorder. For diagnosis, have a history of conduct-defiant disorder. There are 4 categories for this behavior: aggression to people and animals, destruction of property, deceitfulness or theft, and serious violation of rules. Fail to conform to social norms with respect to lawful behavior, harassing others, stealing or pursuing illegal occupations, disregarded to feelings of others, manipulative in order to gain personal profit or pleasure, may lie repeatedly, use aliases, con others, be malignant, and pattern of impulsivity, decisions spur of the moment without consideration or consequences. This may lead to sudden changes in jobs, residences, relationships. Individuals with APD tend to be irritable and aggressive, repeatedly get into physical fights, or commit acts of physical assault. Displays reckless disregard for safety of themselves or others. This may be evident in their driving behavior, reoccurring speeding, driving while intoxicated, multiple accidents, etc. They may engage in sexual behavior or substance abuse that has a high risk of harmful consequences, tend to be consistently and extremely irresponsible. Irresponsible work behavior may be indicated by significant periods of unemployment, despite available job opportunities, or by abandonment of several jobs without realistic plan to get another one. Pattern of repeated absences from work. Financial irresponsibility is indicated by acts such as defaulting on debts, failing to provide child support, failing to support other dependents on a regular basis, show little remorse for consequences of their acts. They may be indifferent to or provide a superficial rationalization for having hurt, mistreated, or stolen from someone. May blame the victims for being foolish, helpless, or deserving their fate. They may minimize the harmful consequences of their actions, or they may simply indicate complete indifference. Generally fail to compensate or make amends for their behavior. Tendency to be callous, cynical, contemptuous of feelings, rights, and sufferings of others. Lack of empathy, inflated self-appraisal, superficial charm are features that have been commonly included in traditional correspondence of psychopathy and may be distinguished of antisocial personality disorder in prison or forensic settings where criminal, delinquent, or aggressive acts are likely to be non-specific. Individuals are more likely to die prematurely by violent means, i.e. suicide, accidents, or homicides. Individuals with this disorder may also experience dysphoria, including complaints of tension, inability to tolerate boredom, or depressed moods. They may have associated anxiety disorders, depressive disorders, substance-related disorders, or other disorders of impulse control. Often have personality features that meet criteria for other personality disorders, particularly borderline, histrionic, narcissistic. The likelihood of developing antisocial personality disorder in adult life is increased by individual experiences an early onset conduct disorder before the age of 10, an accompanying attention deficit or hyperactivity disorder, Child abuse, neglect, unstable or erratic parenting, inconsistent parental discipline may increase the likelihood of conduct disorder that will evolve into antisocial personality disorder. And I have listed here the diagnostic criteria. This is the actual list that they use. A pervasive pattern of disregard for and violation of the rights of others occurring since age 15 years old, as indicated by 3 or more of the following. 1. Failure to conform to social norms with respect to lawful behavior, as indicated by repeatedly performing acts that are grounds for arrest. 2. Deceitfulness, as indicated by repeatedly lying, using of aliases, and conning others for personal profit or pleasure. 3. Impulsivity or failure to plan ahead. 4. Irritability and aggressiveness, as indicated by the repeated physical fights and assaults. 5. Reckless disregard for safety of others and self. 6. Consistent irresponsibility, as indicated by repeated failure to sustain consistent work behavior or honor financial obligations. 7. Lack of remorse, as indicated by being indifferent to or rationalizing having hurt, mistreated, or stolen from other people. The section B, it says, individual is at least 18 years of age. That's another criteria. Evident of conduct disorder with onset before 15 years old. The occurrence of antisocial personality disorder is not exclusive during the course of schizophrenia or manic episodes. There's a difference between having this disorder and then having antisocial tendencies arise from some sort of psychotic episode. For example, with the show Snapped, that's usually on Oxygen, that features women, wives, whatever, family members killing each other. A lot of those, the murderer or the suspect in question does fit the criteria and just was never diagnosed like many serial killers are. But there are instances with drug use, other kinds of mental dysphoria that can trigger antisocial behavior. Somebody who doesn't have a history of any of this kind of behavior and they end up on Snapped, it's because they snapped, essentially the name of the title there. I'm going to go ahead and go into all of the aspects that you can find and down to the specific planets in a chart that are consistent with psychopathic, sociopathic, and was present in serial killers that have their accurate birth information available. I actually pulled all these aspects from a research paper. I can give you the PDF if anybody's interested in reading about that. Her analysis on chart details with serial killers. I'll go ahead and go into that here now that I bored you with 10 minutes of reading from the DSM. Through analyzing patients that have been clinically diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder, mental health professionals conclude that it's partially genetic and partially environmental factors that create the psychopath. They came up with different kinds of genetic predispositions, immediate family members having certain disorders, and they also conclude too that there are some people who have been diagnosed that do not have the criteria genetically to have this disorder. And analyzing different histories of certain people who were diagnosed with this, they've concluded that it has to be partial genetic and partial environmental. And the astrological correlations validate and confirm that theory. So essentially, all of these aspects and these specific signatures in a natal chart do not determine, without a doubt, that somebody will be a psychopath. There are potentials, and then there are environmental factors and influences that discourage or enhance potentials. The analogy of a seed, the seed has genetic origins. And depending on the environment that the seed is placed in would determine its potential. So there can be some individuals who are born with all of these different natal chart signatures that do not become the next Ted Bundy. There can be a couple of different signatures that are present in some people with psychopathic behavior. You would think from analyzing their natal chart that they are very low in the scale of having a clinical diagnosis of APD. But in fact, I actually did a comparison between Ted Bundy's, he's a Sagittarius, and then I looked at Jeffrey Dahmer, who is a Gemini. Notice that they're both polarities. The interesting thing is that I tallied all these up and determined that there's 13 different astrological signature criteria. Just using Jeffrey Dahmer and Ted Bundy's chart in particular, Ted Bundy had 4 out of the 13 possible for having antisocial personality disorder. There's obviously no argument or question that he clearly had something of the sort, if not worse, if there is such a thing. I'm sure you could reference the new DSM and come up with something a little bit worse. When you look at Jeffrey Dahmer, he has a lot more Neptunian in signatures in his chart. He fits more of the criteria, and he had 6 out of 13. So as you can see, there's 13 potential signatures that you can attribute to somebody's natal chart. If somebody can have as minuscule as 4 of the signature criteria, and they can be Ted Bundy, you see where the environmental factors come into play and how the way that that individual is influenced, especially through its early psychodynamic phases. If you refer back to Sigmund Freud's psychoanalysis, so from infancy to 7, the 7 years before first square with your natal Saturn, when you're supposed to be a subconscious sponge and you're supposed to be absorbing everything in your environment, don't start to develop any kind of forms of autonomy until you hit about 7 or 8 years old. That is the crucial time that can be influenced to whether these specific signatures, if they're present in someone's natal chart, can then manifest into sociopathy, psychopathy, or at the very minimal level, conduct defiant disorder. And so the Diagnostic Statistical Manual goes on about how this behavior, even if they're clinically diagnosed, does begin to decrease as they become older, so about the 4th decade of life, so into your 40s and 50s. If you've made it that far, you fill out this criteria, or you secretly are APD and there's really no benefit in being officially diagnosed because there's no cure, there's no medication. There's been different neurological studies done showing that people who lack any kind of empathy or aren't as sensitive emotionally, they just do not have those signals going on in parts of their brain. Not that there's anything that can be corrected chemically in the brain, it's just that they never developed those neurological connections. And funny enough, is in astrology, Saturn is associated with restricting or delaying some sort of development, and Saturn is a factor in a lot of these aspects that I will now go over. First symptom that you would see something like this in a natal chart would be personal planets in mutable signs. So mutable signs would be Gemini, Pisces, and Sagittarius. I would assume that it has to do with the fact that mutable signs are adaptable, more of chameleon types, interchange their moral ethics, their behavior, and also easily susceptible to being influenced by their environment more often than cardinal or fixed signs. Any of those 3 signs being with the Sun, Moon, Ascendant, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. A mutable sign in one of these planets, then I count this as they have one of the criterias. Then number 2 would be a strong 12th house or Neptune signature. Personal planets in the 12th house. Significant personal planets in your 12th house. Also having any planets in Pisces, or they have Neptune in one of the angular houses. So the angular houses define the individual, signify the foundation of the native in question. So that's why Neptune being in one of the angular houses would have significant impact and would be considered a strong Neptune signature. Number 3 up here. This one is absolutely mandatory, fixed or mutable mind, which would be your Mercury. You have to have a Leo, Gemini, Pisces, Sagittarius, Taurus, or Scorpio Mercury. Immutable, the same thing when I was talking about the personal planets, and then fixed if they develop any kind of abnormal psychological ideations or unhealthy mental tics, behavior, or any kind of habits. It's nearly impossible to break it. And if they tend to be mutable in general, like if they have the personal planets that are mutable and then they have a fixed Mercury, they are likely to be camouflaging their unhealthy, stubborn mentalities. Fourth criteria here, personal planets occupying the candidate houses. So it's the 2nd, the 6th, the 8th, and the 12th. The 12th house, which has to do with incarceration of prisons, mental health, psychosis, stability. It's the Neptune house, and Neptune or Pisces is a overwhelming requirement for this kind of signature. I used to think, before I did this study, that the majority of Scorpios or people with Plutonian signatures were more predetermined to become psychopaths or serial killers, especially since there's that fact or whatever that's running around social media all the time about how most serial killers are born in November. Well, there's also obviously some Neptune in there as well, even if they have a Scorpio sun. So, these are the actual aspects that you will look for in a chart. This is the disclaimer again. Just because somebody has these does not say without a doubt that they will start killing people. The moon, obviously having to do with your emotions and the way that you connect with other people. And it also is associated with the 4th house of the angular houses, which has to do with your foundation and your family upbringing. From a psychological perspective, if there's any negative experiences, that will obviously cause hiccups. There's certain signatures that are in a natal chart that will show you that there is an abusive home, in a way already determined from a genetic factor with different aspects. The moon being conjunct with Neptune, that gives the whole fantasy ideation. Sociopathic behavior can actually come out as more psychotic or schizophrenic, and they actually might think it's some sort of game. So the moon conjunct with Saturn would obviously inhibit any kind of emotional bonding with other people, and the moon being conjunct with Pluto, it's essentially giving an extra Scorpio oomph to your emotional complex. And then the moon being conjunct with Uranus, because since Uranus is known for being eccentric, Aquarius would be one of the signs that's associated with narcissistic personality disorder a lot, and narcissistic personality disorder overlaps a lot with antisocial personality disorder. Then if we also have moon conjunct Chiron with some of those psychopathic characters that have a lot of Plutonian signatures, having this in their chart might actually signify some sort of vendetta they have against people. They feel compelled to engage in sadistic behavior to where they can now impose those kinds of wounds and traumas onto other people. And then we look at the trines and oppositions and quincunx. This can be any aspect that's within 135 degrees to 180 degrees with these specific planets. So the moon with Saturn, again, you're seeing a theme here. The moon with Uranus, again, another theme. The moon with Chiron, and then the moon with Pluto. And then we also have Mars with Chiron. It's about how the moon conjunct Chiron would signify there being a vendetta to inflict abusive tendencies, psychological, physical behavior onto other people. This specifically being present, especially if that is present, would be somebody who is sociopathic and who has a sadistic ideation where they feel like they want to torture people as a way of processing some of the abuse and trauma they were exposed to as a child. So those are all the aspects. As I said before, just because you have some of these in your chart or someone has some of these in their chart does not guarantee that they're going to be Ted Bundy or psychopathic, etc., etc. In my personal opinion, I would assume that although psychiatric professionals have determined that it's half genetic and half environmental, I would lean more towards the environmental as being a contributing factor over the genetic. At least a few of these aspects have to be present, but going back to my example before, if Ted Bundy only had 4 out of 13, then obviously not all of those have to be present in order for psychopathic behavior to develop within the native. So that's it. Sorry I got kind of mouthy towards the end. So if you have any questions, go ahead and leave me some comments. I also appreciate any kind of feedback if you want to message me personally. To stay up to date with my latest videos, please subscribe to my YouTube channel. Also, any shares, likes, much appreciated. You can also follow my Facebook page, and feel free to add my personal page as well if you manage to find that. Like I said, if anybody wants the PDF file to that research paper, I am more than happy to email that to people if they'd like a copy of it. Alright, thanks guys.